Welcome to Mex Moves, a weekly podcast in English about Mexican business. This time we're going to talk about Mexico's agro-industrial business. But before we do that, how are you, Daniel?
Very well, Eduardo. Good morning.
Good morning. What are the top stories of the week that you can tell us about, that you saw?
Well, very busy week. Let's kick off with Mexico as a new finance minister. Edgar Amador took over on Friday from Rogelio Ramirez de la O. Edgar, when Miguel Angel Mancera was the mayor of Mexico City for the PRD and was the Mexico City finance minister for almost 6 years. So he has experience in the Mexico City administration. And he has been the deputy finance minister in effect since October. Rogelio, as you know, was a holdover from the previous administration, the AMLO administration. Edgar, I think, is he's very knowledgeable. He's intelligent. He's a good listener. I think one of the big questions is going to be, when push comes to shove, is he going to sort of stand up for fiscal rectitude and when the political pressures come, especially from the more political side of the Morena party, will he be able to stop the spending and keep this deficit which to 4% of GDP, which is the forecast for this year, and then lower than that in the previous year. It's interesting. There was a great article by Salvador Camarena in El País about the sort of different factions within the 4T, the Morena movement on the economic side. And it seems that based on this article, Edgar Amador had a falling out with Arturo Herrera, who was finance minister before Rogelio Ramirez. And basically, for the first 3 to 4 years of the AMLO administration, didn't have a full-time job, at least that we are aware of. And I think this was partly to do with him being the finance secretary under Mancera, who of course backed Peña Nieto and not AMLO. And partly might have been some personal rivalries, even though they'd both studied under the previous finance minister, Ursula. Have you had any contact in your many years looking at Mexico finance with Edgar?
It's funny because I do know Edgar from very long ago, Damien. When I think he finished his master's, one of his first jobs, if not the first one, was with a consulting U.S. firm called Stone and McCarthy. Stone and McCarthy, he was the Mexican economist for them. And Stone and McCarthy was very close to Mike Bloomberg, the company. They shared a building in Princeton, or near Princeton in New Jersey. So when Edgar was hired by Stone and McCarthy, I welcomed him at the Bloomberg office for a while because he needed somewhere to work from before he could also open the office for Stone and McCarthy in Mexico. So this goes way back to the 1990s. And I know Edgar quite well. We chatted a lot back then. He was always a committed, market-oriented economist, but with a social outlook, I must say. He was always very close to the left side of Mexican politics, to the PRD back then, or to Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas and López Obrador. And eventually he joined the administration of López Obrador with Arturo Herrera. And they convinced López Obrador to issue bonds on the Mexican stock market. And I chatted with Edgar, and we were all very surprised. But he said, no, Andrés Manuel has nothing against the markets, but he couldn't convince him to go to the Bolsa. That was what he wanted to do for Andrés Manuel, to show his presence at the Mexican stock market. He didn't accomplish it, but then the bonds were there. And then he worked after the López Obrador administration, he worked for a French bank and other places until he rejoined the administration, I think, with Marcelo Ebrard and the finance minister back there locally for the Mexico City government. And then, as you said, he was the finance minister for Miguel Mancera. Then he had the fallout with Arturo as well as with Marcelo. And I think he was at some point advising Victoria Rodriguez at the Mexico Central Bank for those 3 years where he had disappeared from public view. And now he has a tough job ahead of him because of what you said. I think his main worry should be to bring back Mexico's fiscal stability. And that will not be easy because there are a lot of governors who want more money. The Morena party wants more money to spend. And the resources are limited. So we'll have to see how he manages to travel those very tough waters as the new head of Mexico's finance minister.
That's right. I actually saw him a couple of weeks ago when he was the deputy minister, and he mentioned that he knows Claudia, the president, Sheinbaum, back from student days at the UNAM. They were both active in student politics on the left. Claudia, I think, was a graduate student while he was an undergraduate. He's a bit younger than her. And so their relationship goes back a long way and seems to have sort of withstood or overcome this difference of him working for Mancero, who then became a kind of enemy of the AMLO faction in the left, and obviously the dominant and successful one. Rodriguez, the central bank governor, reported to him in the Mexico City government.
Correct.
And then in the last, when she became governor of the central bank in 2022, she then appointed him as her advisor, and not just any advisor, her top advisor, as by all accounts. So they are very close. So what you will see is a very strong coordination between the central bank and the finance ministry, which I think on balance is a good thing. And as long as central bank autonomy is respected, and he has a big in tray, but I think he's got the right skill set and the right commitment to do as good a job as someone can do. So let's wish him the best.
Without a doubt. And he was expected to come over after Rogelio. Rogelio was there for a year or so, they claimed, or a few months in the Sheinbaum administration. We knew that he wasn't going to be there for the long haul. So now Edgar has had to pick up the job, and I'm sure he's delighted. I mean, for an economist, no other job is more desirable probably than this one, or central bank governor.
That's right. I mean, I think if Claudia had appointed someone from the beginning, from November when she took office, from October rather when she took office, it probably would have been Luz Elena Gonzalez, the current energy minister, who was her finance minister in the Mexico City government. But with Luz Elena only doing 5 months in energy, it was probably too soon to switch her over.
Correct.
So what about you, Eduardo? What have you seen this week that's worth commenting on?
I think one of the biggest news that broke yesterday, Damien, is the appointment of a Mexican as the chief executive officer of one of the largest automakers in the world, Nissan. We're talking about Ivan Espinosa, who took over the reins, will take over the reins of the company on April 1st. I think that's amazing. I don't think any Mexican-born person has ever been the CEO of a large automaker as big as Nissan is. He has a very tough job ahead of him. Nissan is not in the best of shapes. They've just broke off talks with Honda for a potential merger, which seems to be one of the reasons why Ivan's predecessor had to step down, and Makoto Ushida. But now he is head of this company, which is struggling and has been since probably the 1990s. He's the only second non-Japanese person to lead Nissan. Before him, it was Carlos Ghosn, which we all know very well because of some of his scandals and escapees from Japan in a cello case or something like that. A very fascinating story in a way. I'm sure not very pleasant for him. So now Ivan has the challenge of trying to put Nissan back in order. I've read and I've heard that his products, he was the chief planning executive of Nissan, and so he knows products very well. And this is something where Nissan has been faulting in terms of EVs or hybrids. So his appointment sends the signal that Nissan is betting that he could bring back products on its own, not necessarily on a merger with Honda, to put the company back on a good footing. So again, another Mexican reaching a top echelon in the business world. I don't know if you have heard much about Senor Espinosa.
I don't. I was surprised after from the Nissan perspective, the disaster of Carlos Ghosn, who was obviously Brazilian Lebanese, and he ended up in jail in Japan and then escaping to Lebanon. You'd think they would be cautious about putting another Latin American in that position, but evidently and rightly they've seen no connection between having a Brazilian and a Mexican run those jobs.
No, he's been with the company for much longer than anyone else, probably 2003. He's a very young man as well, 46 years old. So we'll have to wait and see how things turn out. As we say in Mexico, se sacó la rifa del tigre. But again, who wouldn't if you're in that business and if you've come a long way through the rank and file, to be able to steer a company as important as Nissan, which great presence in Mexico, by the way, which will suffer a lot if tariffs get placed by the U.S. auto cars produced here. So a lot on his plate and a lot that he will have to deal with in the coming months. And again, like you said with Edgar, we wish him luck. and see how he does.
So two private sector stories that came out this week that refer to things we've talked about in previous podcasts. One, Mercado Libre, and the other is Plata. Mercado Libre was rolled out in the presidential mañanera, the morning press conference, as global CEOs are asked to do these days to prove
more
that
often than before, haven't they?
Yeah, I think they want to show that Mexico's a great place to invest. Anyway, they unveiled a $3.4 billion investment in Mexico for 2025. That's a 38% increase from the previous year, and that's going to go on financial services, Mercado Pago, and logistics for Mercado Libre, and technology investment. And we'd mentioned in our podcast a couple of weeks ago how Mercado Libre so far in Mexico has outfoxed Amazon. I think Mercado Libre's market share of e-commerce in Mexico is around about 40%, whereas Amazon is only about 25%. And it seems that Mercado Libre is even, if anything, stretching that lead. And with this huge investment, it wouldn't surprise me to see it gaining even more ground against Amazon. Obviously, unlike Amazon, it has a very vibrant fintech offering, and indeed it's applied to have a bank in Mexico, whereas Amazon, for all intensive purposes, has no fintech product offering by itself in Mexico. And talking about fintech, Plata card, which is a credit card that's been operating in Mexico for a couple of years now, and we talked about in our first podcast, the beginning of the year, has just raised $160 million in the Series A from some mostly US and European venture capital and private equity funds. They say the valuation is $1.5 billion, which will make it one of the fastest ever unicorns in 2 years that Mexico has seen. Plata's, as we mentioned, was set up mostly former executives of the Tinkoff Bank in Russia that left Russia after the Ukrainian invasion and supported by Bering Venture Fund. And then they seem to be doing well, and obviously they've raised a lot of money in what is a challenging market for many of the credit card businesses in Mexico. So the newest, remains, challenged to report profitability in Mexico. But Plata, applying a lot of the technology that it used in Russia, seems to be doing quite well. It has 1,500 people. Majority of those are people from Russia and Eastern Europe, and it's got a very heavy tech focus. What about tariffs? Before we move on.
Well, tariffs, they did put them on steel and aluminum last night, no, Damien? Mexico was not exempt as Canada was. Is that right?
No, Canada was not exempt. So Canada was exempt for a few hours. Trump said they were going to...
Oh, because of the dispute with Ontario.
Yeah, so for a couple of hours, Canada was going to pay allegedly 50% tariffs, and they went back to to 25.
Crazy world.
Yeah, so that's a bit more significant than in the past if you read the executive order, because it's not just the final steel and aluminium product that's facing the tariffs, but also a lot of intermediate products that have steel and aluminium in them. So that's going to also hit car exports from Mexico to the US, and to the extent that they have Mexican-made steel and aluminium.
Okay.
Now, Mexico is a net importer of steel and aluminium from the US, so impact will presumably be reduced by the fact that most of the steel and aluminium will be from the US and therefore won't be subject to that tax. And we may even have an ironic situation where, in order to avoid the tax, Mexico imports all its steel and aluminium from the US with a very clear detrimental effect on its local steel and aluminium industry if it doesn't get an exemption. But we also saw on Friday the US relented, as you remember. It feels much longer than a week ago, or less than a week ago, on the 25% across the board tariffs on Mexico and Canada, and made tariff-free USMCA compliant products. Now, the issue there, Eduardo, is that today only about 50% of Mexican exports were registered under USMCA. Right. The other 50% was using most favored nation, which, because the tariff difference was minimal, it wasn't worth them proving rules of origin and other factors. By some estimates, of that remaining 50% that wasn't USMCA compliant, about 40 percentage points of that could be USMCA compliant if they fill in the paperwork. So we're left with about 10% that actually doesn't comply with the USMCA. And I was reading in some of the newspapers, BMW, for example, has a big plant in San Luis and exports BMW cars to the US, and they're not compliant, so they're going to be hit. So it's not going to be, in the short term, It's going to be a major paperwork issue for half Mexican exports to the US, but in the medium to long term, it is going to impact Mexican exports that are not compliant. And, Mexico had become, to use the phrase, a backdoor for a lot of Chinese and even, in this case, European products that were going to be sort of reassembled in Mexico and then exported to the US. And now that's going to be more challenging. So I think that, combined with the uncertainty, because of course they've only been given a reprieve until April the 2nd, and then Trump and his administration will unveil the much longer awaited reciprocal tariff strategy. All of this is creating a huge amount of uncertainty. There are some substantive impacts, as I just mentioned. It's going to hit investment in Mexico, and Mexico's economy is already slowing down. The US economy is also already slowing down, which has an indirect knock-on effect on Mexico. So I think a lot of the estimates for growth for Mexico this year, which were hovering around 1%, are probably going to be cut quite substantially. May even see growth, nearer 0% this year than 1% if this tariff uncertainty continues, not just affecting Mexico, but affecting the US, that then affects Mexico.
As we said, Edgar Amador has a tough job ahead of him. But what you just mentioned about the tariffs makes it even more daunting in that sense. I did read that those companies that don't comply with USMCA rules of origins have a period of certain time where they could file the paperwork and comply. So hopefully many who hadn't done it because it made no sense with 2.5 tariff versus now 25% tariff, they will do so. So the flows of Mexican exports will not be as hard as they could, if and only the reprieve until April the 2nd stands. And Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's president, did raise the case in the Zócalo on Sunday, where she said that she was confident that because Mexico has no tariffs on U.S., this new reciprocal approach will exempt Mexican exports, those that comply with USMCA, from facing that 25% tariff that hangs on Mexico's head like a sort of Damocles. So we'll have to wait and see. She's confident about that. Trump is always, you never know what to think of what he says. But that makes sense, and we talked about it before, as long as it doesn't go into the value-added tax and other items that we've mentioned. So a lot of moving pieces still in the air, and we'll have to wait and see how this all comes out.
That's right. And on FinTech, the other news we saw this week was Walmart, which we've also talked about previously, announced that it's going to be offering a debit card that its customers can use not only in Walmart, which they can currently use with a Cashi card, but also use that debit card elsewhere in any other shop. And I think it's probably a question of time before Walmart applies again, in fact, because it used to have one, applies to be a bank. And FEMSA, of course, announced in its fourth quarter earnings conference call that it's also applying for a bank. Mercado Libre is applying for a bank. So we're going to see the big retailers, really, FEMSA through OXXO, Walmart, Mercado Libre, 3 of the biggest retailers, very soon going to have banks or financial entities that are similar to banks. Obviously, Coppel and Electra have banks.
Yeah, we've talked about them.
And I think this is all good news for Mexico, which lacks financial penetration of key credit products. But it is going to be a challenge for a lot of the, newcomers that are going to see yet more competition and a fairly crowded market.
Why do you think, Damien? We know that Walmart had a bank, Banco Walmart, no?
Yeah, that's right. I sold it to in Bursa.
So what has happened? Why do you think it's technology that is making them look at this sector again with OXXO, Walmart, all this? Because they thought about it before. They all thought about replicating Electra and Coppel's model. Then they backed down, and now they're coming back again. What has changed?
Yeah, I think that if your main competitors have banks and using the banks to attract customers, then you think twice if you don't have one. I think specifically Mercado Libre, where if you look at Walmart in the US, it's actually done a very good job in the last 2 years of taking on Amazon, and its stock price has reflected that. And its stock price in the US has done well. Whereas in Mexico, Walmart's e-commerce offering hasn't yet really taken off. Partly because in Mexico, marketplaces are key to e-commerce, and Mercado Libre dominates marketplaces, and Walmex's marketplace offering, but partly because it's a lack of fintech, or at least that's in their mind. And of course, the Walmart Mexico CEO, Ignacio, comes from Mercado Libre. So I think they're looking at how successful Mercado Libre is. It's grown 100-fold in the last decade in Mexico. They're thinking, we need to match what they have, otherwise we're going to be left behind. And I think also technology has made getting to your customer a lot cheaper. I think that smartphones are now,
so prevalent everywhere.
Completely prevalent, whereas that wasn't the case, a decade ago. So I think technology has changed, competitive landscape has changed, and the management has changed, and all of that has probably led to this happening. But the key question: most of the profits in the financial sector come from credit, right? Payments is a very low margin business,
right?
So what are they going to do on credit? And that's where most of the risk is. What are they going to do on credit? What's Oxo going to do on credit? They're going to move cautiously. Are they going to work with other players? Are they going to do it themselves? That's going to be the key question. Whether they're truly a competitor to the banking system and to credit-intensive fintechs, or whether they're doing this mostly as a defensive move and as a data collection move and a payments move and a customer loyalty move.
The beauty of this is that all the pieces are moving, changing rapidly, and like you said, it's good for consumers, good for the Mexican financial system to have greater penetration. Maybe it's even good for tax authorities to have all this digital world out there being at their hands so that they can control better tax payments and crack down on avoidance of payments. So we'll have to wait and see how this unfolds.
That's right. So one of the constitutional amendments, Eduardo, that the current government has pushed through is to ban GMO corn for domestic production. What do you make of that? Do you think that is a good or a bad idea?
That's such an interesting topic, I gotta say, Damien. I go back and forth on it. I sometimes take the conservative approach that I think GMOs should not be in our bodies, genetically modified food. And at the same time, I am a believer in change and a believer in technology. And I think sometimes these scary transformations are for the good and the benefit of people. But I think we will continue to see this struggle going on, although the Mexican government has a very clear picture about it. Regarding white corn, are they banning GMO seeds and planting in Mexico for all types of corns?
For domestic production,
For domestic production. So I think that would put in a disadvantage corn producers here, unfortunately, because Mexico imports a lot corn, yellow corn, and they have to allow the GMO corn to come into the country because of the panel's ruling that went against Mexico. So, and I suspect that GMO corn, yellow GMO corn, is more resistant to plague or a greater yield by square hectare. I don't know. I'm not an expert in agriculture, but these issues are complicated in that sense. I think you have to be careful with the authorities not to be drastically one way or the other. And in this case, they're putting it in the Constitution. So to reverse this will take a lot of political will. So I wonder what's going to be the outcome for those that are growing corn in Mexico in massive terms, not for consumption, but for feedstock.
Yeah, it's a problem because right now Mexico isn't using GMO anyway, and its productivity reflects that. So I think that Mexican corn yields average about 3.2 tons of production per hectare, and that compares to the US, which is over 10 tons per hectare. So as a result, 3 times. So there are other factors at play, obviously scale and technology, but Mexico's become very unproductive in corn, which of course Mexico,
was the birthplace
of corn. And the vast majority of corn is yellow corn for livestock. And as a result of that, and it's a curious fact that Mexico is the largest single importer of corn in the world. And that is both because its own corn industry has been held back by lack of investment. The land plots are small, partly and not exclusively because of the ejido agricultural system, which makes it difficult to roll up farms into a sufficient scale to be big. And partly because of lack of access to credit and capital, and therefore capital. So they're capital starved, they have small scale, and they don't use GMO. So, result of all that. In addition, Mexico is quite a big agricultural producer, and obviously these livestock are consuming corn, yellow corn. So the fact that Mexico, has a big poultry business, and which means that it needs a lot of corn to make it sort of intermediate agriculture products efficient. And also Mexico is next to the US, which is very efficient globally in corn. So it's able to be quite effective in intermediate agricultural products.
There's been a transformation, I think, in the agricultural sector of Mexico with all these more sophisticated products. I don't know if they're more sophisticated, but with more high value added probably products like avocados, tomatoes, berries, lemons, limes, chili peppers. Mexico is a powerhouse on those produce. And maybe part of the problem that you're addressing about Mexico not being able to produce enough corn for its needs here and the need to import it has also to do with the fact that landowners have switched to these other products that are being very successful in America. I mean, the avocado craze is something that's being reported left and right, but Mexico also exports tremendous amount of tomatoes, grapefruit, orange juice. So there has been a transformation in the agro sector in Mexico. And we're witnessing with these very large plantations dedicated to other products other than corn.
No, that's right. There was a great story in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago about avocados, which we've also touched on in previous episodes, how U.S. consumption of avocados has tripled over the last 20 years. And that's in part due to NAFTA and tariff-free imports of avocados from the U.S. It's also partly because Mexico has the ideal kind of climate conditions for avocado, especially in the state of Michoacan. But one of the things it pointed out was how technology in avocados, talking about how agricultural technology can be so useful where it is applied, has allowed the avocado to ripen much more quickly. So apparently, according to this article, decade or so ago, avocado in the supermarket was very hard, as hard as a baseball, because it would take a long time to ripen. And people wouldn't buy avocados that were really hard because they couldn't imagine them being soft and edible. And now, thanks to this change in ripening technology, the avocado is soft in the supermarket and stays soft and not too soft so that you can eat it. And that has contributed to a big increase in avocado production. So technology, can be very important in driving demand for these products. And that's an example. And then the other thing that the article highlighted was that there is every avocado sold in the US, a few cents are put into an avocado marketing fund. And that, as anyone who's watched the Super Bowl can attest to, has allowed, avocados to be amongst the biggest advertisers on US television, thanks to this fund. And that's also driven demand. So as you say, Mexico's become highly successful in more value-added crops, such as avocados, raspberries, tomatoes, and meanwhile, it's importing ever increasing amounts of corn to feed the livestock. And because I think about 50% of agricultural land in Mexico is still in the ejido system, and that doesn't give it scale. And as I mentioned, it's very difficult for them to get credit at the right price to compete with the US farmers.
I think people would be surprised to know, Damien, that Mexico's agri-food exports probably is now larger than oil. We've not been doing very well in oil in that sense. But you were here when Mexico's oil industry was representative of 80% of all exports. How things have changed. Agribusiness is not about 9% of total exports. So it's not a small sector, and it's not unimportant for the Mexican economy.
That's true, although there isn't a pure sort of agricultural company in the Mexican stock market.
Correct.
Whereas there are, half a dozen in Brazil. So Mexico has sort of finished food businesses like Gruma and Grupo Bimbo in the stock market. It used to have Bachoco, which is a poultry company, but that's now been delisted. But on the primary side, where you're much more subject to commodity price variations, or even on the fruit and vegetable side or the protein side, there is nothing in the stock market, unfortunately.
I think part of that could be, it could be addressed to why not a lot of Mexican companies list on the stock exchange from all sectors. And we've even seen a few of them being delisted for valuations or costs regarding regulatory framework. Yeah, I think, there are large agricultural companies out there that could be very attractive, but for reasons that go beyond me, are not enticedly to put their shares up for investors to purchase. Maybe this will change, I don't know. And you could see a lot of these companies when you travel across Mexico, how effective and how productive and how modern they are in terms of their capabilities of growing their produce in Mexico.
Yeah, there was a FIBRA REIT Agrofriba listed a couple of years ago, hasn't been, and they were renting out land and
For
production
agricultural process,
and production facilities
right.
for agricultural purposes, but it hasn't. They weren't able to deploy the capital in the way that they hoped they would be able to, and so it hasn't been. They've actually had to return a lot of the capital that they raised from the Afores, the pension funds here, because it wasn't deployed in the agreed time frame. So that, so far at least, hasn't panned out as the original shareholders hoped.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. And shall we leave it at that?
I think so. It's a real pleasure to have with us today John Antonius. John is one of the foremost experts on Mexico's agricultural sector. He helped set up the grain division at Glencore here in Mexico. He was the former CEO of Luis Dreyfus in Mexico City. He's worked at least 4 decades in the agricultural sector in Mexico. John, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, John, tell us a little bit about your experience in the Mexican agriculture sector before I get into questions.
Well, I started in the agricultural sector in Mexico in the cotton business when Mexico used to produce a lot of cotton. And then throughout the years, I switched to grain because the company I was working with did switch to grain, and so did I. And the rest of my career has been in the grain business.
So, John, Mexico is one of the largest, if not the largest, importer of yellow corn or corn in general in the world, yet it's a big exporter of high value added vegetables like fruits, like vegetables and like avocados, raspberries, and tomatoes, and so on. How do you explain that dichotomy?
Mainly the size of the land owned by the landowners. To have good yields and to produce large volumes of grain, you need a lot of investment and you need larger parcels of land, like in Brazil, Argentina, Canada, United States, Australia, etc.
But Mexico has obviously lots of land, so why hasn't?
But the ownership is limited. The ejido reduced ownership of land, and you can't produce as much grain per hectare on 4 hectares or 10 or 50 or even 100 as you can in thousands of acres or hectares, because lack of investment and economy of size.
The government has recently passed constitutional changes, or in the process of passing constitutional changes, that ban GMO in corn production. What's your view on the impact of that? Is that just symbolic and political, or will it have a real impact on Mexico's agricultural sector?
It's not going to have an impact because that's the way it's been forever. I suspect that production in Mexico, especially of corn, could increase to a large extent if those restrictions were lifted.
As you understand it, do those restrictions apply in any way to the imports of corn, or is it just
obviously not, because Mexico imports today about 25 million tons of corn, being the largest importer in the world, having surpassed Japan. All the corn imported in Mexico is GMO.
So explain to me, Mexico recently lost a panel arbitration in the USMCA vis-a-vis importing of GMO corn. If Mexico is anyway importing GMO corn, what was behind that arbitration?
Well, because it was getting away around the non-importing of corn in Mexico, which is needed. If you didn't import all this volume of corn in Mexico, we'd all be very, very hungry.
Why do you, and maybe it's related to this, but why do you think in Brazil there are at least half a dozen or more agricultural companies in the stock market? In Mexico, as far as I know, there are none at all. And yet Mexico is a very big producer. I think Mexico's exports of agricultural products are now higher than their exports of oil, for example. So it's not a small sector in terms of revenue generation. Why is none of it in the stock market?
Because there aren't the companies that produce, like avocados, garlic, and berries especially, are not huge companies, or are subsidiaries of companies that are in the stock market but don't publish their agricultural activity.
And how big for the global commodity companies, a couple of which you worked at, like Dreyfus and Glencore, how big and how relevant is Mexico for them? Is it a big top 10 market in terms
Yes, yes. Mexico imports about all grains. Mexico imports about 45 million tons of grain. The Soviet Union, when at its biggest import levels, was 45 million tons. Mexico today imports 45 million tons between wheat, corn, soybeans, barley, oats, etc.
And what are the Glencores? What's their business model? How do they make money out of this?
Just merchandising, like they do all over the world. I mean, it's merchandising. It's Glencore, Dreyfus, Cargill, ADM, etc. They're positioned all over the world, supplying grain and originating grain from all over the world and selling it all over the world. They're global grain merchants.
And is Mexico a pretty open market? It's pretty similar to...
Yes, it is today. It's a pretty open market, very private. The buyers are private companies, so it's pretty open and pretty fluid.
And if you wanted to make Mexico, which is one of the ostensible goals of this government, more self-sufficient in food, and what you're saying is that we're very far from self-sufficiency,
Very far,
despite the political rhetoric. And let's say, you were agriculture minister. What would you change to make Mexico
well,
more
first of all, I'd make large land ownership more accessible, which despite the constitutional reforms is still not all that accessible. Make financing a little bit easier. And this is strictly for corn. Allow the farmers to plant GMO seed. GMO seed is has one big advantage as far as Mexico is concerned. It's resistant to drought. And Mexico has suffered and will continue to suffer many droughts.
Terrific. Well, that's extremely helpful and interesting, John. Thank you for joining Mex Moves, and I hope you can come back on the program on another occasion.
Anytime.
So thank you, everyone, for listening to Mex Moves. We encourage you to subscribe on Spotify or Apple Music, YouTube.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll hope you tune in next week as well.